Thank you very much. It's really a delight to be here and to be invited. I actually started my research here at the Roosevelt Library, and I'll tell you how that happened. It's just such a wonderful event, and to be in the company of other authors that are here is really wonderful too. So I'm going to do three things today. The guy I wrote about, who you don't know probably because he is not well known, but he had a fascinating life. I was a student of his, as you said, at Wake Forest University. And I'm going to talk about why we should care about him first. That's the first thing I'm going to do. The second thing I'm going to do is talk about why at the Roosevelt Library and what was his connection to the Roosevelts, both Eleanor and Franklin. And the third thing I'd like to do, which I think is perhaps most important, is his influence on journalism and his key principles that he brought about. When I did the book, I knew that Wallace Carroll was a hugely respected journalist during his time period. He was born in 2006, and he died in 2002. So he literally covered the whole century. And both before and during World War II, he was a very well-known foreign correspondent. And then he went on to be the news editor for the Washington Bureau of the New York Times under Scotty Reston, who, if you know, famous journalist, was a very famous journalist. And then he ended his career as editor and publisher of the Winston-Salem Journal, where he took the paper to a Pulitzer Prize. As an addendum, he and his wife, after he retired, were very key in preserving the New River Valley in North Carolina and Virginia. So why should we care about him? There's a lot of journalists out there. A lot of them had adventurous stories, but I doubt that many really had the number of different and length of experiences as Wallace Carroll. When I had him as a teacher, he didn't talk about himself at all. He taught a course on the First Amendment. This was in 1977, and you kind of knew that he was a special person. And we read a lot of Supreme Court cases. We talked a lot about the First Amendment, obviously, and what that meant. And then about 6 years ago, I was in London, and I picked up a book called Citizens of London by Lynn Olson. And it's about the four key people who were in London at the beginning of World War II, Gil Wynett being one. Gil Wynett's papers are here at the Roosevelt Library. He was the UK ambassador after Kennedy in England in World War II. He was one of them. Averell Harriman was the other one, and the other one was Edward R. Murrow. Everybody knows who Edward R. Murrow was. So I was reading the book, and Wallace Carroll's name kept coming up all over the place. And I thought, who knew? You know, wait a minute, what's going on here with my professor? And Wallace Carroll was the United Press bureau chief in London in 1939. So he had a staff of about 75 reporters who were covering England at the time on the cusp of the war. He was from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. At the age of 22, UP sent him to Europe, to London in 1929. He covered the hunger riots there. Then they moved him to Paris, and he covered the Stavisky riots and the whole sort of rise of the left and the right in France, and also the rise of fascism. Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, so this had the French very nervous, of course. And then they made him the diplomatic reporter at the League of Nations, beginning in 1934 to 1939. So he had a first-hand, eyewitness account of the rise of fascism, the attempts to try to quell it, which were pretty ineffective in the League of Nations. And he came across pretty much anybody who was anybody at the time, diplomats and others. And then when he became the bureau chief of UP in London, he wrote about the Battle of Britain, he wrote about the Blitz, he was meeting the soldiers when they came back from Dunkirk. And then after they thought they had got through the Blitz, I say they because his wife was with him at the time, he got a call from his boss at UP and said, "Oh, can you get to the Russian front?" Because the Nazis had just invaded the Soviet Union. So he got himself on a boat going up through Archangel, was one of the first correspondents going into Moscow, covered the fall of Moscow, well, it didn't fall, but covered the Nazi advance towards Moscow, went out to the front lines, filed numerous dispatches, and then when the Nazis were about to enter Moscow, he interviewed Stalin. In London, he had interviewed Churchill. He had interviewed all the famous people, including Gandhi, when he was in London. And Stalin said, okay, all the diplomats and the journalists are going to go to a forlorn place called Kubyshev, which is in southwest Russia, because literally the Nazis were about 3 miles on the outside of Moscow at this point, and Stalin wanted to get these people away. So they went to Kubyshev, and then he realized he couldn't file any stories from there, so he had to get home. And the only way he could get home was to travel east through some pretty crazy, forlorn places, Iran, Tajikistan, Pakistan, and he literally did this by canoe, by railroad, by taxi, by camel at one point. And in a 6-month journey, he got himself to Manila in the Philippines, and then he got himself on a boat that was headed to Honolulu, Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, that was supposed to land on December 7th, 1941. So this was a guy who happened to get himself everywhere that was historically important and put himself in the middle of the action and be able to write about it. His boat to Pearl Harbor was somehow, suspiciously, I never found out why, delayed by a couple days, so he actually landed in Pearl Harbor on the 14th of December. But because he knew the information officer for Admiral Kimmel, who was at that time head of the Navy there, they allowed him to go on a boat, and he was the first correspondent to see the devastation that had happened. And they said to him, "We can let you go, but you can't report on it. You can tell your bosses back at UP what you see, but it can't come out in the paper," because at that time they didn't want to overblow, they were very careful about what kind of information they wanted to get out. So he made his way back from Hawaii after that, went to San Francisco on a boat, and came back to meet his family in New York again. So this is the adventure story. And I was lucky enough to get some tapes that he had made of presentations he gave to the Winston-Salem Journal when he was older. And these tapes give you a blow-by-blow, you are there, person-by-person description of all of this. And that makes up the first third of the book because he had a long life. So he had a lot happen after that. But, he was a little bit like the Forrest Gump of the time, because I kept finding out, wait, he was here? Or, oh, he knew this person? For example, I was reading the book about Ernie Pyle, and I was actually reading Ernie Pyle's actual book called Brave Men. And there's an account of it in the book where he's standing on a rooftop looking at the bombing of St. Paul's Cathedral and the fires around it with 2 friends. I have the same account in here because it was Wallace, Carroll, and his wife. So he knew Ernie Pyle, he knew William L. Shirer, who was his best friend. Shirer was the guy who wrote about the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany. But he was not about self-promotion, and he never went into radio. His office was right across from Edward R. Murrow's, and he said, "I was doing what Ed was doing, I just wasn't doing it on the radio." He never went into TV. Walter Cronkite, he had mentored Walter Cronkite at some point. So he was just that kind of a guy. He had a lot of dedication to the written word and not to self-promotion and publicity. And I have to say that this is part of what attracted me to the story, because I was a journalist. We all know journalists, and this is a little unusual that journalists are so modest and they don't really want to put themselves out there all the time. So I found that to be a very intriguing part of his character. However, just to go on from there in terms of what he did, when he got back to the States, he was going to go back to London for UP and report. And this is where the Roosevelt connection comes in. He got a call from a guy named Elmer Davis. Elmer Davis at the time, in the late 1930s and 1940s, was the most popular radio commentator. 12.5 million people listened to him every night. He had a slot that came on at 8:45 to 9 o'clock every night, and he was from Indiana. He was homespun, and he was trusted. He was American. He was sort of the kind of guy who had his feet on the ground, and so on and so forth. But Elmer Davis had been asked by Franklin Roosevelt to head up what was called the Office of War Information. Now, the Office of War, has anybody heard of the Office of War? Okay, this is part of the story, the history that is new and not very well told. And I found out about it because Wallace Carroll's papers were at the Library of Congress. And in those papers, he really talks a lot about his time at the Office of War Information and what happened there. It was set up by Roosevelt to basically be the propaganda arm for the war. There was a domestic division, which was charged with working in the United States to promote the war aims. And there was a overseas division, primarily a European division, and that was where they asked Wallace Carroll to go because he had spent so much time in Europe. And they asked him to run this, or to be the deputy director of this operation out of London. But his director would be a guy named Robert Sherwood. Anybody know who Robert Sherwood was a famous playwright, and he was Franklin Roosevelt's speechwriter. And he coined the term arsenal for democracy. He won 3 Pulitzer Prizes for plays that he did in the 1940s. He was a brilliant writer, obviously, and Roosevelt put him in charge of the overseas division with Wallace Carroll as his deputy, and Robert Sherwood was to stay in New York, and Wallace Carroll would go to London. Now, Robert Sherwood was a wonderful playwright, but he was a horrible administrator. He wouldn't answer his mail. He had fits of temper. He was up and down. He was moody. And Carroll would be in London trying to work with the British government, which had a huge propaganda arm. And he couldn't get authorization from Sherwood to do anything. He couldn't get Sherwood to return his phone calls or letters or answer any correspondence. So Carroll, after doing quite a few things to build up the office there, one of the main things they had to do was to let the English people know what the Americans were about, because they were about to be coming over, all the soldiers and so on and so forth. So his first thing was to send information out to the British people about America. And Peggy helped him, his wife, helped him with this, and I don't want to forget Peggy, they did that at first, a huge effort, and then he was charged with what he called capturing the hearts and minds of those under the Nazi boot. In that, he was responsible for letting the people who had been conquered by the Nazis know that help was coming, giving them information. He set up the radio operation to do that. He was instrumental in the start of the Voice of America, and so they were working. They had a staff at the time, at the end of 1943, of 300 people, but then he couldn't take the Sherwood situation anymore. It was really so frustrating to him, because Sherwood would not only not respond to his requests for approvals and information, he was denigrating Carroll left and right, and sort of was just a very difficult personality to deal with. So he quit, and he came back to the United States. Roosevelt, Elmer Davis did not want him to quit. Nobody on his staff wanted him to quit. Everybody agreed they would quit with him. He convinced them not to quit, to stay, because the job was too important. Elmer Davis came back and went into Roosevelt one day, and this is all accounted in the book because it's in the papers here. And he said, if you have to give me complete control, Sherwood is out, I need Carroll back, and if you don't, I'm quitting. So Roosevelt put Elmer Davis and Sherwood in a side room, and as Roosevelt liked to do, he wanted them to fight it out. Fight it out over there, and at one point Elmer Davis said that he felt Roosevelt thought they were like schoolboys that had to be hit over the knuckles for not getting along when there was a war on, and so on and so forth. Anyway, Elmer Davis won that contest. He became back in charge of it. Sherwood was sort of put out to the side a little bit, and then Carroll went back and started to work some more from Washington on with OWI. And there's questions, and I'm sure you're thinking, how can a journalist be a propagandist? I thought that when I was writing it, and I'm going to go into that, and I'm happy to answer questions about that, because propaganda has this extremely negative connotation now. But Carroll really, well, I'll go later into that. Anyway, To come back, he wrote a book about his, he had written 2 books, one about his time in Russia, called We're in This with Russia, and then at the end of the war, he wrote a book about his time in OWI and what it meant to persuade and win the minds of people. He really felt that military objectives had to be met with information. People had to know why things were happening, the why behind military efforts, even though he thought during the war the information was to support military efforts. So this part of OWI, I think, is, people have said that it's a new kind of, it's new research, new history a little bit. Not as exciting as the foreign correspondent stuff, but it's there. Then finally, he decided, his friend Scotty Reston had become the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times in 1955. He asked Carroll to join him there, and he became the news editor, basically running the day-to-day operations of the New York Times. And there were a lot of very famous people that he mentored. Anthony Lewis, who wrote Gideon's Trumpet, is one, a whole list of people. And then he got in a disagreement because the Times New York office wanted to edit his copy, and they wanted to change quotes that he had. There's one quote he had. He was there from 1955 to 1963, and he had a quote in there from John F. Kennedy, who he was covering, that he said, Kennedy didn't say this. They said, oh, I don't care, put it in anyway. So Carroll said, okay, I'm out of here. And he went and became the editor and publisher of the Winston-Salem Journal. So long life. If you're interested in history of the 20th century, if I had to do it again, I'm not sure I would cover his whole life because it's a lot. It's a lot, but he was there, and it's in the book. I want to end, because I think it's very relevant today, with what he had to say way back in 1940 and in the 1950s about journalism and what journalism should be. Now, while Wallace Carroll, he was somewhat well known back in his day because as a UP reporter, his stories were put on the newspapers all over the country, and especially when he was a foreign correspondent. And he had a reputation coming out of the war for writing a lot of stories, and especially his coverage of Russia. He was seen as sort of a Soviet specialist. He had tremendous influence on the journalism community and on journalism. Even though he was a very quiet man, he was hugely respected. And I have a little bit of a story to tell about that. Donald Graham, who is the son of Catherine Graham, who was the publisher of the Washington Post, wrote a wonderful autobiography, I think it won the Pulitzer Prize, was mentored by Wallace Carroll. Catherine Graham's husband committed suicide in 1965, and at that time Donald Graham was 17 years old, very interested in becoming a journalist. And Wallace Carroll wrote him and said, why don't you come to the Winston-Salem Journal, where he was then, and get out of Washington. And Donald Graham will never forget that because he was so kind to him and brought him down there. And so when I was doing the book, I called up Donald Graham, who I don't know, but I called him up and he gave me some wonderful quotes for the book. And then I told him a story that he absolutely loved. When I was working at the Winston-Salem Journal in college, I was an intern, very nervous, very scared, sitting in the corner, worried what assignments I was going to get. And the clack-clack back then and the noise of a newsroom, which is also in the book, what it was like to be in a newsroom at the Winston-Salem Journal back then. All of a sudden, it went dead quiet. And I'm sitting in the corner, and I didn't know what was going on. And I looked around, and everybody in the newsroom had stopped working and stood up. And were looking towards the back door where somebody had come in. Wallace Carroll had walked in, and everybody literally stopped working and stood there like this. And Donald Graham loved that story because he said reverence is very short in newsrooms. So he loved the fact that this was the kind of respect within the community that this man had. And then, to show his kindness, he walked over to me, everybody's staring, and said, are they giving you good stories, Mary? I was a student then, so I got really good stories after that assigned to me. Anyway, that's an aside. But I want to go back to the principles of journalism that he talked about. In 1955, he wrote a paper for the Nieman Foundation. And in this paper, he talked about the tyranny of objectivity. And what did he mean by that? to him, and remember, this is a guy who watched the rise of Mussolini, Hitler, lived through bombing, went into Russia, had a fair amount of good experience about tyranny and the rise of fascism. And his thesis was that just because there's two sides to a story, you don't have to tell both sides if one side is a lie. And he really felt strongly about that, and he referred to Eugene McCarthy's rise to power, and he thought the newspapers had played a key role in McCarthy's rise, because McCarthy would say an outrageous thing, and the papers would print it. So, we don't have exactly the same thing now, but because they didn't have cable news back then. But these are sort of fundamental, and now in the journalism community, there's a lot of discussion about objectivity and what that means, and what journalists are obligated to report, what they're not obligated to report. And I think some of these lessons that Carroll had way back then would be useful to sort of think about today within the journalism community. And there are many journalists who have supported the book and him. Margaret Sullivan, who was the media columnist for the Washington Post, wrote me a great review of the book. That's sort of the first principle that he kind of put out there. Back then, he thought that you don't just report on the news, you do your background. It's not just the facts. Absolute commitment to attention, detail. All of these things sound, oh yeah, sure, of course. But, he really grounded into his reporters. His reporters were terrified because if there was a grammatical slip in something, he would put a blue Post-it note on the bulletin board. And boy, you were in trouble if you got a blue Post-it note. He thought, actually, that journalism, as quaint as it sounds, is a public service, not a profit-making venture. And when he was at the Winston-Salem Journal from 1963 to 1974, the owner was a guy named Gordon Gray, who gave him absolute independence, and also plowed every profit that the paper made back into the paper. And, we've gotten pretty far from that. And that, I think, is something a principle that is worth revisiting. He also believed in total independence, independence from the business side of newspapers. And again, these all sound like simple principles, but we veered from them in some cases, and I think we do well to remember some of these things. The other thing he warned about was the role of the press in fighting against dictators, fascists, people like Eugene McCarthy that would come. And he said the press has to meet its obligation to call these people to account. And I'm going to read you from the book, which is at the end of the book, what he wanted to leave people with in the journalism community. The book has been, it's a challenge to write a book about a non-famous person because, people like to read about famous people. But in this case, I think it's very, very gratifying that the people who are in the business of journalism and know good journalism really responded to the book. If they didn't know Wallace Carroll, he had a son, John Carroll, who was also a very famous journalist. He was the editor of the Los Angeles Times. He died in 2015, but he took the paper to 13 Pulitzer Prizes, hugely respected in the journalism community, and they were both very much alike in the way they approached the profession. So we got a lovely review in the Wall Street Journal by David Shribman, who is I know the Wall Street Journal, but it's not, well, I won't say it's not their editorial page, but their book review page is very, very good. And sorry. David Shribman was an editor at the New York Times, for the Pittsburgh Gazette, and he wrote at the end of his review, "If I may end on a personal note, when I joined the Washington Bureau of the New York Times in 1981, Wallace Carroll had been gone for 18 years. I never met the man, though hardly a week passed without hearing his name and feeling his legacy, often expressed as a conditional phrase, what Wally Carroll would have done. Somehow I ingested those lessons, as did so many of my bureau colleagues. 5 of us became executive editors. And when it came my turn to run a newsroom, some of those Wally Carroll values came tumbling off my lips too. It wasn't until Centuries Witness that I understood the origin of the way I sought to practice journalism. And I think the man led by example. He had a stellar character and a quiet influence. And again, I found that worth writing about and worth spending time with. And I don't know what time it is now. Oh, I'm going to just read you one paragraph from the book, which I think summarizes his philosophy of journalism. And again, it may sound a little quaint, but I hope people will think about it in this day and age and come back to it. Carroll also believed that journalism had a higher calling, and that was to give citizens the information they need and deserve to know in order to preserve democracy. The press is not perfect. It makes mistakes, he would acknowledge. But among the founding principles of democracy is the need for the powerful to be called to account by ordinary citizens, that the truth as presented to citizens matters, and that reasoned reporting of the truth is not only possible in our society, but essential. In calling for an end to the Vietnam War in his editorial Quo Vadis, I didn't talk about this, but in 1968 he wrote a very famous editorial calling for the end of the Vietnam War, which his friend Dean Acheson gave to Lyndon Johnson, and is widely credited with changing Johnson's attitude towards the war and him running for president. It was on all the front pages of the paper. So in calling for an end to the Vietnam War in his editorial Quo Vadis, he demonstrated the power of that approach. It did not need to come from the halls of the Defense Department, but from a trusted journalist at a regional paper who understood the danger the country was in. He believed it was up to citizens to decide what kind of country they wanted to live in. His job was to give them the facts and a rationale for reaching such a decision. In the end, he felt they would do the right thing. Wallace Carroll, I think it's high time that people know about him because he really had a remarkable life. And like those in his generation, he really influenced, I say at the beginning, and there are even things I haven't touched on here, that we all know what that generation did. They won a world war, they brought about peace, they brought about multilateralism. They really, we owe them a tremendous debt for what they did. And he was a big part of that, as were many people. But I think in the journalist community, he was definitely a mentor and a leader in that. So thank you very much for coming. And questions, if people have any. There's many things I didn't touch on. It's but I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think you made a terrific case for why he's so valuable today. I just have a question about one detail that you said with the New York Times, said that he left the New York Times because of this misquoting or the making up quote.
Right.
Had he talked about that experience, or how? Because that was pretty damning.
Well, this is what happened. When he was at the New York Times, they had a change of management. And when he first started to work there, James Reston, who was head of the Washington Bureau and very well connected with the New York Times. I mean, he spent his whole career at the New York Times. He had a very famous column for many years. He had an independence in the Washington Bureau from New York. And they had a change of management, and the New York office people started to want to review the copy of the reporters and the news people in the Washington Bureau. And he didn't like that. And his reporters didn't like it. Max Frankel, who was a very well-known reporter, said sometimes reading your own copy made you want to lose lunch right there because they had edited it so much. And, that he put up with this for a while, but then when it was one of his stories, and the quote was about, I don't know, you probably don't remember, it was the steel strike, and he quoted one of Kennedy saying that, I don't remember the exact quote, but it cast Kennedy in a bad light, and it wasn't what Kennedy said. But the people in New York insisted that he make up the quote. And this was the last straw. This is when he said, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not, this is where the independence thing comes in, and the truthfulness thing comes in too. And, that happens in newspapers. You do have editors that, I've worked in newspapers, and sometimes if you have the head boss who wants to give a certain impression, they tell you that, and you either stomach it or you don't. I don't want to say it's totally prevalent, because but it happens. But for him, that was just, And when he went to the Winston-Salem Journal and Sentinel, it was a terrific paper. It was doing really well. It had a wide circulation. He became the publisher and the editor, and he had fun. The newsroom was fun. They covered all kinds of things. They were instrumental in the launch of the School of the Arts in North Carolina through editorials they did. He covered the demise of the tobacco industry and didn't hold back in publishing, when the Surgeon General's report came out in 1964, the hazards of smoking. And, the town was run by R.J. Reynolds, so he got a lot of heat for that. Desegregation he was in favor of, and wrote editorials to that and coverage to that effect. So that was what he contributed to his community. And, one of the problems now in journalism, and I'm sure you've read about this, is this dearth of local newspapers. And it's horrible, because you do not, I went back to read the Winston-Salem Journal in the 1960s. It reads like the New York Times. I'm not kidding you. It was full of international coverage, full of investigative reporting, full of stuff. The town council was covered all the time. The school board was covered. Everything was. And the fact that we don't have that now, I think, is a huge, huge problem. And many people, like Margaret Sullivan, have written about it. And he left, he had international fame, national fame, and he left that to go work for a regional paper because he wanted to be independent, and he could affect that community. So.
We have a couple minutes for other questions.
Did he regret any mistakes that he made? Did he regret?
Oh yeah, yeah. There were mistakes he made, and he did regret them, and he did make mistakes, I'll tell you two of the biggest ones. He was taken in a little bit by Joseph Stalin. When he came back from Russia, they sent him there because at the time there was not the intelligence service we have now. They relied on journalists. George Marshall called his boss in and said, is there somebody you can send to the Soviet Union when the Nazis invaded? Because we don't really know what's going on there. And we need to know if they're going to be able to hold off the Nazis. And he went, he spent, about 4 months there, not that long, but he went to the front lines, he interviewed as many people as he did, and he came back and he said, yes, I think that the Nazis will be held back, which was not wrong. But then he said in his book, We're in This with Russia, that he wrote afterwards, that he didn't think the Soviets would try to expand into Eastern Europe after the war, and he got that real wrong. And he sort of turned into a little bit of a Cold War warrior following that, because he got that wrong. He sort of didn't figure out. And the atrocities that Stalin did in the 30s at that time were not so well known, but he missed that one. His biggest regret, and what he did, was when he was in Pearl Harbor, he went around and he did think, based on reports he'd gotten, and he had it confirmed by the Navy, that there had been Japanese-American conspirators on the island. And we know how horrible the result of that was in terms of in the US. He was not the only one that did it, and he did one article and didn't do anything else, but it had an effect, and he always felt bad about that. But, he went out to the fields, and he said there were crosses in the fields that indicate, in the corn, the sugarcane field, to indicate where the plane should go. And he interviewed people, and he said he thought there weren't a lot of conspirators, but there were Japanese-American conspirators. So that was a boo-boo. That was a big mistake. He didn't get everything. He didn't get everything right.
You didn't mention Peggy.
Oh gosh. I don't want to keep you all, but the reason I'm here is because Gil Wynett, Peggy worked for Gil Wynett, who was the ambassador, and his papers are here. And I don't know how to describe her other than to say she was an absolute force in his life. I got a box of her letters when I'd almost finished the manuscript that she wrote her mother from London during the Blitz. She was hugely intelligent. Her letters are so vivid. I was able to put them in the book. It was a partnership. It was a complete partnership for 63 years. And she went to Vassar, She was an economics major. Her father had been the head of the Rockefeller Laboratory Institute, had developed the first yellow fever vaccine. She had lived all over the world. If you read the book, it's a story of Wallace and Peggy, and I'm sorry I didn't have time to bring that up.